Hi, Dave here. To finish up part B of video 3 of our 5-part video series on chapter 17 of Swing and Absolute Java. On part A, we talked about JLabels, color, and the border layout and flow layout managers. Part B, we'll finish up on grid layout and talk about JPanel. A key idea, a concept we wanted to think about that we talked about in part A was to try to think hierarchically of boxes within other boxes. And each box can be arranged differently. It can have its own manager of how things should be arranged. Another way to think about this is containers within a container. And each container has its own management or layout strategy. The second topic to think about was visibility. If I click a button and it calls a method on a listener, how does that listener get access to the GUI or a GUI component? And the way it's going to get access, at least during this presentation, is by us passing the references at the time of constructing the listener. This is key, and please look out for that concept when we talk about it. Other observations from last time: we talked about Oracle and Sun giving us all these classes and methods, and how we should take advantage of the getters and setters within them to get properties and set properties. It's impossible to know all these methods and all these parameters, so the best thing to do is look at method completion within Eclipse and also to consult JavaDoc. So grid layout managers. A grid layout manager arranges components in a two-dimensional grid with some number of rows and columns. So here we're setting a layout, and we're calling new grid layout. So we're calling the constructor with two arguments, one for the number of rows and one for the number of columns. And a key aspect of this grid layout is each cell within these rows and columns is going to be the same size. And each component is going to be stretched so that it completely fills its cell or grid position. Now, when using the grid layout class, the method add has only one argument. We can't tell it what cell to go into. We can't say I want you to go into the top right or bottom left. No. We got to place these in the grid from left to right. The top row will be filled first, then the second, and so forth. Now, grid positions may not be skipped. So here's the window we're going to be creating. It's going to have 5 labels on it. The first row is going to have 3 columns. The second row will have 3 columns, but we're only going to use the first 2. So we're creating the class GridLayout JFrame. And following good practices, we're going to extend JFrame to get all the inheritance of key members and methods that we want to access. Inside of our constructor, we're going to start off by calling our parents constructor and give it a title. We're going to set our layout to a new grid layout with 2 rows and 3 columns. And remember, we're going to start filling first in row 1, column 1. So we'll create a label, first label, we'll add it, row 1, column 1. We're going to create a second label, we're going to add it. We'll go in row 1, column 2. We're going to create a third label and add it, row 1, column 3. We're going to create a fourth label and add it, row 2, column 1. You get the idea. So we've got 3 layout managers. We've got the flow layout that displays components from left to right in the order in which they are added to the container. And each component can have a different size. A border layout is going to display the components in 5 areas: north, south, east, west, and center. And you specify the area that it's going to go into with the second argument of the add method. And remember, when we place these, perhaps in the north, it's going to get stretched along the width of the screen. Then we have the grid layout. It's going to lay out components in a grid, with each component stretched to fill its box in the grid. Right, but every cell is going to be the same size. So panels. A GUI is often organized in a hierarchical fashion, with containers called panels inside other containers, boxes within boxes. A panel is an object of the JPanel class that serves as a simple container, and its purpose is to group smaller objects into a larger component. And one of the main functions of a JPanel object is to subdivide a JFrame or other JPanel. So we're going to look at a paneldemo.java example. We're going to see both the JFrame and each panel in the JFrame using different layout managers. In fact, panels can be added to each panel, and each of those panels could have its own layout manager. This enables us to create almost any type of layout. We just need to sit down and be creative in how we're going to lay things out and assemble things to get what we're after. Now, this example, we're going to have a JFrame using a border layout, and it's going to hold two panels. One panel, the big one in the middle, is going to hold three other panels in a grid layout with one row and three columns. The other panel is going to go down the bottom. It's going to hold three buttons in a flow layout. So here on the top, we see the initial window as it comes up. We see this large gray mass in the middle. That's going to be one panel that's filling the center of the JFrame. In the bottom, we've got a J panel with three buttons in it. That's the border layout south of the JFrame. When we click the red button, it's going to turn the red panel in column 1, row 1. It was formerly gray. It's going to turn it to red. When I click the white button, the panel in row 1, column 2 will turn white. When I click the blue button, the panel in row 1, column 3 will turn blue. So once again, when I click a button, it's going to create an event, fire an event, and it's going to send it to a listener. And that listener is going to call this action perform method. And I'm going to want that action perform method to change the color of one of these three panels, red, white, or blue. To do that, I need to have a reference to that panel, so I can call it set background method. So how do I get that reference? I get that reference because at the time the listener is constructed, I want to pass it the panel. Keep an eye out for that. So here's our code. We got our panel demo. It's going to extend JFrame. And note that I've created three data members here. And each data member is going to be of type JPanel. And here's where I'm going to store the references to the three panels that I'm going to want to access at some point. Now inside the constructor, we call our parents constructor with the title string, panel demonstration. I set the layout of the JFrame to be a border layout. I now create a local variable called bigger panel of type JPanel. And this is going to be that big panel that lays a border layout center in the JFrame. And this big panel is going to have a layout itself of a grid layout with one row and three columns. So in column 1, row 1, I'm going to create a panel. I'm going to put in the data member red panel. I'm going to set its background color to gray. Remember they all came up gray. And then I'm going to add that red panel to the bigger panel. So it's the first panel to be added to the grid layout, so it will go in column 1, row 1. I then create the white panel. Set its background to gray. I then add it to the bigger panel, so it goes into column 2, row 1. Then create my third panel, the blue panel. Set its background color to gray, and then I add it to bigger panel, so it goes into column 3 of row 1. I now have my bigger panel. I want to add it to the JFrame. So I'm adding it with the border layout center, so it will stretch to fill as much space as possible. I now create my button panel. So a variable button panel, set it equal to an instance of a JPanel, set its background to gray. I'm going to use a flow layout now. Flow layouts are good for laying out buttons. I now create the red button to put on it. I set the background color of the button to red. I now add an action listener to that button, and it's going to be an anonymous action listener. New red panel listener. Now note, here's where I'm passing the reference to red panel. So here, at the time of creation, I'm giving the listener a reference that it can hold on to so that later on, when it gets called, when the action perform method gets called, I can go out and reference that red panel. I then add the button to the button panel. I do the same thing for the white button and the blue button. When I'm done creating the buttons and putting them on the button panel, I then add the button panel to the J-frame, and I ask it to go on the south. So you saw I've created 3 anonymous listeners. Here's an example of the blue panel listener. It implements action listener. I have a data member called blue panel of type JPanel that I'm going to hold to store the reference to the panel that I'm going to want to talk to eventually. This blue panel gets set at the time of construction of the blue panel listener. It gets passed in the constructor and it sets that data member blue panel. Now later on, if and when the blue button gets clicked and the action perform method gets called, I've already got a reference to the blue panel. So I can directly say, blue panel, set your background color to blue. Now a typical GUI is typically going to have 3 kinds of objects. It's going to have the container itself, probably a JPanel or JFrame. It's going to have components. These are the labels, buttons, checkboxes, text areas, text fields that we add to the container. And we're going to have a layout manager to position the components inside the container. Now, when you start to develop a GUI, you might want to consider doing it in 2 steps or 2 main subtasks. Step 1, design and code just the appearance and layout, what it's going to look like. Get that right, and then worry about designing and coding the actions to be performed in response to user actions. So in step 1, when you create your listeners, you might just want to stub out their action perform methods. Okay, this should set you up well for video exercise 2, where we'll have a chance to create a tic-tac-toe board and lay out some buttons.